Thank you, Frank. Right, we'll see how the technology works. So first of all, a little bit about what moths are, their closest relatives, and where they are on the sort of evolutionary scale. So the caddisflies, order Trichoptera, are the nearest living relative at the moment, and Trichoptera and moths split off from other insects sort of numerous millions of years ago. And the best way of finding out, tested the laser pointer and it's not working. I knew I should have brought my salmon fishing rod. So we'll have to literally
Leave the lights there.
Yeah, that might be an idea. So the amber record, basically, even if you buy bits of amber jewelry at the airport or whatever, they have fossilized, preserved. Thanks, Steve. That's. Oh yeah, laser's working now. So the amber record, mainly from Scandinavia, Russia, a few other places, got lots of insects in, and you can identify them roughly, reasonably easy. Actual fossils of butterflies and moths are very rare. There's a tiny number, I think, again from Russia, some in slate mines and things. So basically, caddisflies, Trichoptera is Greek for hairy wings. So if you look at their wings just under a hand, magnifying glass is fine, you can see there are little tufts of hair, whilst Lepidoptera, moths, Greek for scaly winged, are basically like tiles on a roof. So if you're ever not quite sure whether it's a Trichoptera, caddisfly, or moth, hand lens will tell you reasonably easily. And then the classification is quite out of date. Lepidoptera is probably an outdated term. Really, the whole lot, butterflies and moths, should be moths, including micromoths. And then macromoths, the bigger ones, are just one superfamily within the whole order, Lepidoptera. And then butterflies are two superfamilies, the skippers, Hesperoidea, and Papilionoidea, the actual butterflies within moths. So that's how it should be, but it'll probably, because the current terminology is in such widespread use, it'll probably never get revised to what it should really be. So that's just put them into the spectrum. And then having said that, there's lots of speculate. You can speculate and pontificate non-evidence-based as much as you like about the continental split and what's happened with these species since Pangaea was the original supercontinent before it all split up. And it's just quite interesting in Cumbria, if you're happy to speculate, because these are two Cumbrian moths, very common, one called Cetaceous Hebrew character, and they're remarkably similar. That's basically at sea level here, and at Papua New Guinea, which is right on the equator at 2,800 meters, you get an endemic one, which is incredibly similar. And because even though it's on the equator, obviously that huge altitude makes it habitat-wise actually quite similar to Cumbria at the latitude we're at. And again, we talked about the netted carpet, which is one of the real Cumbrian endemic specials. One here remarkably similar, again, from the Ecuadorian Andes at 2,500 meters. So it may be that their precursors were around on Pangaea, and then when the continent split up, they've actually hung on the equivalent of the Cumbrian ones of diversified, evolved, mutated, and found nice little niches in the high mountains, high equatorial mountains, such as Mount Kinabalu, the Andes, and star mountains of Papua New Guinea. Or it may be convergent evolution, like with so many other things, where they end up looking the same, although they're relatively unrelated. So there's, with DNA studies coming online, there's probably going to be a lot more of interest in that. And it's quite, on the World Moth Group, it's remarkable, like our populations and species are incredibly similar to, there's another moth enthusiast, Carl Barentine in Spokane, Washington State. And it's amazing how similar what Carl gets there is what we're all getting in our moth traps here. So just something of interest. So briefly, the history of moth trapping with light goes back to Roman times, AD 60s. They had beehives, and both these wee beasties of death's head hawk moths, used to raid the hives for honey, and then there are little micro moths called wax moths that destroy the wax. So the Roman honey makers, beekeepers, got a bit peed off with this and put out, there'd been wooden buckets with candle lanterns in to try and attract the moths. And even before that, I couldn't find the reference, but it is supposedly somewhere in Homer's Iliad about the Greek armies camped outside the walls of Troy, noticing that moths were attracted to their campfires, and hence the name, one of the moth families, Pyralidae, which in ancient Greek means lovers of fire. So it goes back a long, long while, actually trapping moths into history. And then the Victorians, who are avid moth trappers, would have used paraffin tilly lamps highly effectively. And then the Robinson trap, which is always quoted as a gold standard, came along in 1950. Heath trap with a tube bulb with UV mercury vapor and UV light, 1965. The Rothamsted survey, which is a continuous survey of UK moths, started in 1967 and is still going. And then 2010, huge leap forward, low wattage LED bulbs used on mobile lithium batteries. So you could literally, walk up Helvellyn and put your moth trap up the top of Helvellyn rather than having to carry a generator. So there's we'd have a little bit more on the spectra. There's been a lot of research on the spectra of the UV light a bit later. So again, here we've got the luxury of the actual insect collection in Tully House as reference, as well as the old records, the contiguous records since I think about 1888. Here's an example of a death's head hawk moth in the collection here in this building that was trapped in 1956 in brilliant condition. So again, it's an amazing resource to have. And Liz Still, who's a previous county moth recorder, did a huge amount of work in updating the records from going through all the old specimens and correcting and verifying identifications, which was fantastic work a few years back. So just for the birders, why get interested in moths? Not just to look at all the amazing species and study the moths themselves, but they're now known to be key in the food chain, particularly for migrant insectivores. So like pied flycatchers and redstarts, which arrive here completely knackered, protein depleted in spring. And before they start brooding their chicks, they need to feed up with first post-migration to get into breeding condition and then brood their chicks. And that's a moth larva there is far more proteinaceous and nutritious than winged insects. So basically, we know these are noctuid larvae, and the adults basically come out in about March and they lay their eggs. So the larvae will be out sort of 6 weeks later or so, ideally when the oak trees and what have you are in leaf and the pied flycatchers arrive. And it's Tinbergen in Oxford many, many decades ago showed that did equivalent research on great tits and showed that they were able to vary their brood time by about 3 weeks if there's a variation in weather. So if it was an early spring or a late spring, to coincide brooding their chicks with these moth caterpillars. Now, it's thought that the migrants from Africa haven't got the same adaptability to vary their brood time, delay sitting on the eggs or whatever, to get the hatch of caterpillars right. So that's possibly one of the reasons why pied flycatchers, for instance, have very variable success rates every year. So it's relatively easy for us moth people to count the number of the adults before the caterpillars arrive, and probably can give some kind of prediction then whether it's going to be a good year or a bad year, say for pied flycatchers. Obviously, there's a possible option. If you know it's going to be a bad year, then you could put a colony of captive mealworms out by your pied flycatcher nest boxes, possibly. So again, a little bit about their biology. We keep thinking, why do their populations of adult moths and butterflies, come to that, vary so hugely from year to year? Obviously, it may well be climate change and variability in climate. Got some slides on that towards the end of the talk, but almost certainly very dependent. There are two major groups of parasitoids. So parasitoid is lethal, what's a parasite like tapeworms and us or dogs or whatever is non-lethal. So the ichneumon wasps are one of the two main groups. And there's about 10,000 ichneumon species, I think, in the UK. They're very poorly studied because they're so blooming difficult to identify to anything like species level. But they do come to UV light moth traps. There's a recent interest in trying to identify and record them in the moth traps. And almost certainly, if they are studied in numbers, you find that these ichneumon wasps have their own population cycles, dependent on what, I don't know. But obviously, if the ichneumons are doing very well, they're going to clobber the moths and butterflies. And if the ichneumons are in a downward population cycle, the butterflies and moths are probably going to do quite well. And the other main group of lethal parasitoids are these Tachinidae diptera, which basically lay their eggs and maggots in the Lepidoptera larvae. So again, it'll be quite dependent on those. Just a little bit, I think this is great fun, these toxins and warning colorations. The garden tiger moth, which is again quite common in Cumbria, it's declining a lot in the south of England, but it's still doing quite here, has this woolly bear, it's called the caterpillar, which probably a lot of you will have seen. And they feed on pretty much any herbaceous plant. They're not fussy about what they feed on. And most of their food plants don't contain toxic alkaloids, but somehow or other, they metabolize their food plant to a neurotoxin that blocks acetylcholine, one of the main neurotransmitters in the central and peripheral nervous system. So blocks the transmission of that across the synapse. And the chemical is only starting to be analyzed, but seems to be remarkably similar to Mr. Putin's Novichok. So it's all a bit weird, really. And then an example of co-evolution. So there's pink, bright pink warning coloration that both of these are toxic and to birds, are distasteful to birds. So the cinnabar moth, which is family Erebidae, tiger moths, and the burnet moths, family Zygaenidae, burnet moths, have co-evolved coincidentally to look very similar. And it's termed Müllerian mimicry when that happens. So both reinforce each other's appearance. They're totally unrelated, but the fact that there are two species groups of moths that look bright pink and birds soon learn not to peck at and try and eat, and they're completely unrelated. And in the cinnabar, the toxins basically pretty much unchanged. The pyrazillin alkaloid in ragwort, so the one that kills horses if horses eat ragwort, whilst the clever old six-spot burnet moth feeds on field scabious, which as far as I know is non-toxic, and manages to metabolize it to hydrogen cyanide of all things. So I think Midsummer Murders should really have an episode of mad moth recorders who sort of poison half the village, really. It would be quite a good episode. I'm not offering. And then just a little bit on microbes, because I think there are 2,600 UK species of moth altogether, and only 800 of those are macro moths, so big, chunky, sort of usually reasonably easy to identify ones, and the others are micros. So they tend to absolutely phase people when they start. So you tend to just pick out the easy ones and ignore the sort of LBJ equivalents, at least when you start. But there are lots which are fairly distinctive and obvious, and you don't need to dissect their genitalia and things to identify them. So these are, and they tend to leck, a bit like black grouse lecking. The males flutter around with these huge long antennae bushes in the spring and early summer. They're spectacular things. And just one more slide on micromoths. Again, they vary from the very distinctive, this 20-plumed moth. So each individual ray is separated. It's so like totally different from all the rest of the Lepidoptera. And it's just one family that again is all in every continent, of just a tiny number of very similar species. So again, that's probably one that must have been around at Pangaea before continental split, and is now basically relatively common on all of our continents. And the plume moths are very distinctive. Some of these micromoths are beautifully coloured, iridescent colours. Now, it has to be said that the vast majority of them look like these bottom two, and they're the sort of warblers of the moth world. You have to be pretty expert to get them anything near species level. But we've got an expert down in Lancashire, Steve Palmer, who's the national expert on these Galecchidae, which have little palps a bit like snouts. So anything that's not sure about, Steve will give an opinion on. And some of these do, basically, if you really do want to identify them, you do need to lethally collect them, pin them out, and dissect their genitalia. So that's obviously not for everyone, but I sort of just point out that it can be done. And in fact, the chap who pioneered all this on blue butterflies in the early 1970s, I coincided with, because he was just recently retired professor of gynecology down in London. And then when he retired, he went over to moth genitalia. Lionel Higgins. So top sites to visit if you want to go and see moths or try a mobile moth trap. Those sites, I won't read them all out, but represent some of the best top Cumbrian habitats, and you can get permission from the either wildlife trusts or owners sort of fairly RSPB fairly easily to do moth trapping and help them out with records and things. Fortunately, we're not in Westminster, so I thought of adding Jeremy Hunt's Wallet as a good moth habitat, but it won't extend as far as Cumbrian. Well, one of the top Cumbrian moth species is the rosy marsh moth, which was, I think, mainly in East Anglia up till about the 1860s. And then when they drained the fens, it became officially extinct. And then it was discovered in Wales, I think roughly in about 1980s or something like that. One colony in coastal Wales on a peat bog there. It feeds on, it needs both bog myrtle and bog rosemary to keep going. And then Rob Petley-Jones from Natural England basically found it at Roudsey Moss in 2005, which was an amazing discovery. And it's fluctuated a bit there. It's monitored every year by Rob and some other people like myself. And we got a record count of 43 in 2 or 3 moth traps last year. Usually only get, I think this year there's only 1 individual. So again, huge fluctuation in the abundance year by year. But the fact that we got 43, I think was a great accolade to the bog restoration. They had to get rid of all the rhododendron. And when they flailed the rhododendron, they pretty much had to flail a lot of the mature bog myrtle as well. So there was a dip after that, and quite a worry that it could have been severely compromised. Then it's really bounced back very well. So it's quite gratifying for the bog restoration. And the Roudsey just looks tremendous now. All the rhododendron's gone. And it's just the most fabulous spot to visit. So heathland, that's one of the threatened habitats, isn't it? The acidic heathland, and South Cumbria, some of the alkaline heathland, like on Whitbarrow. And you get some quite nice day flying moths. So it's not all about staying up all night or getting up with stupid o'clock in the morning with UV light moth traps. So a lot of the best ones can be seen during day flying. So some of these tiger moths are tremendous. The wood tigers, it's always skulky. It's really difficult to get a good photo because the moment you see one, they're quite obvious when they fly. They just dive down into the undergrowth below the grass. So the Latin name should really be Innominatus skulkans, which is skulky so-and-so. A limestone pavement has some nice micromoths on these Pyrausta micromoths, which are absolutely beautiful colors. And the commonest one feeds on mint. So not just on limestone pavement, wherever you get mint, if you look hard enough, you often find them. And again, I think they're actually on the increase, so on the southern stream. This is the rare one that's just on limestone pavement, but they're beautiful things. So the limestone, classic one that's on the limestone in massive decline in the UK is the barred toothstripe, a geometrid moth. And it used to be, until recently, very common in the North Downs and South Downs and all the Cotswolds, I think. And because it's feeding on ash, we've now got ash dieback, the population's just absolutely crashing. And South Cumbria is one of its few refuges. It can be attracted to pheromones, synthetic pheromones, so the female synthetic version of the female pheromone with lures rather than light traps. But there's a bit of concern that the pheromone trapping is maybe possibly too effective. It was originally developed by forestry for pest control of species like the pine processionary moth. So if it is used for survey of rare species, you've got to be incredibly cautious and careful that you're not overdoing it. So the Nadal forest, the wet Atlantic Celtic rainforest, I think it's now called. So good examples of RSPB, Haweswater. It's fantastic, it's beautiful, and the lichen people get very excited about it as well. It's absolutely superb place and a great place to moth trap. And the species you get there, it's interesting, all these Victorian vicars who named them. Dotted carpet, fair enough, that's a species you get there. And the Saxon, its current distribution is wherever the Celts were in Celtic rainforests, but nowhere on the east side where the Saxons were. And in fact, if you actually look at the old records, you find that the original site for it in the UK was actually in Yorkshire. There was some wet Atlantic forest way back in East Yorkshire. So that's why they called it the Saxon. And I think that colony's long since gone, but it's relatively common in Cumbria and up to the west side of Scotland. The netted carpet, that's our other real special. So again, I think it's always been in central Lakeland and wet woodland, and its food plants, touch-me-not, balsam, the flower, it's there, and the food, the leaves there with the caterpillar on it. And then it was officially, I think it probably was over collected by the Victorians, and unfortunately they wiped it out, and everyone thought it was extinct. And then it was rediscovered, I think roughly in the 1960s, and it's monitored every year by counting the caterpillars, because it's relatively easy to count the touch-me-not balsam plants because they're obviously out in flower at that time of year, and then you can count the caterpillars on them. So that's an annual collective project that's done every year, and it seems to be holding its own very nicely. So Montan hilltops are one or two nice species. This one on the right, that's a little moth up there, is incredibly rare and only known on the extreme high peaks, the Cairngorm, some of the Western Highland peaks, and one or two in Lakeland, and was found by Jamie Normington from Cumbria Wildlife Trust. And then you've got the grey mountain carpet, which is one of the species flagged up by butterfly conservation as in massive decline. And obviously it's fleeing northwards and fleeing up in altitude, but we get it on most of the Cumbrian fells in small numbers. The scarce silver wye, which is very similar to the common silver wye that we've probably all seen as migrants. And then this beautiful yellow ringed carpet is now one of the UK's rarest moths in massive decline. And that one was found at Harter Fell Crags up above RSPB Haweswater when we did a survey there. Beautiful moth. Now, more and more urban settings get very important for a lot of these species. So the spinach moth, again, quite why the Victorians named it the spinach moth, because it feeds on blackcurrant, not spinach. And it was one of the commonest UK moths in suburban gardens, allotments, village vegetable patches, fruit gardens. But then with pesticides, it's almost become extinct. I think there hadn't been a Cumbrian record for quite a long while until it was found at Susan's farm. Of course, the Aglion Bees farm's been organic ever since they started, I think, for many decades. So again, that was a great accolade to their organic farming to find, it was only one specimen, I think 3 years ago, hanging on by its sort of toenails there. More and more suburban gardens are important habitat. So the old lady moth seems to be relatively common in Carlisle. There's one Stephen Mott found. The box tree moth, Stephen Mott's as well. That's unfortunately, it's coming from Southeast Asia in imported box plants. It's not meant to be here. It's absolutely rife in the south of England now, destroying everyone's box hedges and natural box on Box Hill in Surrey. And then this actually, I haven't got a photo of a red underwing, but that's a light crimson underwing, which is closely related to it. And again, that crops up this year. I think a few were found in Carlisle and Brampton, but we very rarely, if ever, get it out on the sort of wild natural habitat. So more and more, as with so many other things, suburban gardens are getting to be a really important key habitat. So just a bit on wildlife gardening. If you want to sort of make a moth-friendly garden and see some nice spectacular moths, oak's top of the list. That has the greatest biodiversity for supporting moth caterpillars. Then sallow, and then those other ones. So just quickly run through that if you plant in your garden those plants in a few years' time, what you'll actually get. So oak, you've got that array of amazing spectacular species that feed on oak. And the merveille du jour, again, it's another wonder of naming, really, in that, of course, it's nocturnal, so it should be not merveille de nuit rather than merveille du jour. And its species name is Aprilina, and it flies in October, like right now. So presumably the Victorian vicar who named it probably on his third sherry by the time he came up with the name. Sallow, again, some real spectaculars like poplar hawk moth, eyed hawk moth. Those all feed on sallow. And just give a very quick life history of the puss moth. So I've got a nice colony of those in my garden now. So the caterpillar is quite spectacular. And then it spins its cocoon, it changes color, spins its cocoon. You can see some silk there. And down the bottom, the silk cocoon, which is really tough. It's one of the toughest cocoons known, I think, in wildlife world. It's so tough you couldn't make silk out of it. So the adult moth, in order to hatch out, it has a tooth. It doesn't have feeding mouth parts for feeding on nectar, but it's to swap those for a tooth, and it spits out bench acid to cut a circular hole in the cocoon as it emerges. So again, another amazing adaptation of nature. Good old bramble, and everyone clears bramble out, but as well as it being the flower being an excellent nectar food plant for adult moths and the berries for birds, it's tremendous. All these spectacular moths shown there, basically the larval food plant is good old bramble, so it's worth leaving a bit. And rosebay willow herb, I'm biased, personally think it's nicer than many garden plants, but certainly in our village, you get parties of people going out and pulling it up because they think it's a weed and don't like it. But if you do leave a bit, you get these fantastic, both small and large elephant hawk moths and Montfordy micro moths as well that live off it. So I planted hedges, moved to Cymru 15 years ago, started planting biodiversity hedges, and I chose the hedge plants from looking up the what species I wanted as food plant for moths. And as well as the common species, last year did really well. We got these 3 declining species labeled by Butterfly Conservation. So the V moth, that's another blackcurrant feeder. So if you spray your blackcurrants with the insecticide, it's gone. It's declined 99% of the population since Rothamsted survey started 1967. And interestingly, it's at Kirk Oswald allotments as well. They're organic. And then the dusky lemon sallow, massive decline, but that feeds on elm, would have originally been common elm, now I was going to say Dutch elm. Wych elm, yeah. So we've got wych elm at home, so it feeds on, and then the flounced chestnut, which it feeds on just about anything, any tree, broadleaf tree, I think, but for some reason it's in massive decline, but we're finding it in Cymru and surrounds recently. So a bit more on moth trapping. It's interesting, you can never prove this, but why do moths actually, are they attracted to light? Do the Romans obviously sussed it out with their beehives and things? So it's not known, but the thought is that they've evolved to be able to fly in a straight line to find mates, find nectar, find the right food plant to lay eggs on, and that they use the moon as a light source of infinity. And mathematically, a tangent to infinity is a straight line, which is what they've evolved to. So then when man came on the planet and started building campfires and now electric lights and industrial estate lights, what have you, the closer the light source becomes, then the tangent becomes initially a gentle curve, and then when it's really close, a very tight curve. So that's why you see the moths circling round and round it until they hit the light. So that's probably the best explanation, but it's pure theory. It's impossible to prove. It may be incorrect. So light spectra, there's been a lot of work on this done by a scientist called Broome in Germany, and he's also had a team in Peru, seeing which spectra of non-visible light, so like ultraviolet and visible light, are most effective. So the answer is for most moth species, taxa, visible, violet, blue, green, and ultraviolet, most of all, is most effective. That's red, orange, yellow is least effective. So he did that for moth traps, but the huge spin-off is thinking, so a lot of insect decline, bird and bat decline is thought to be distraction of all these massive lights now that we have in industrial estates, street lighting, what have you. So they're experimenting in Germany and the Netherlands on trialing essential lighting being orange and red spectra LED, low voltage lights, rather than the current white light. It'll take a few years to work out how good that is, but it could be a really good way to go, because you never eliminate the lighting altogether, but to use spectrum which doesn't attack moths and nocturnal insects. But the law of unforeseen consequences, they've tried this in an eco-lodge in Borneo, I think mainly not so much because of giant moths flying around their lights, but because they were flying into the faces of guests and paying a lot of money, and the guests didn't like it and grumbled. So they changed to yellow spectra, but what they couldn't predict is that yellow spectra attracts leeches. So now if the posh visitors put their hands on the lit handrails, they get covered in leeches. So it just shows you can't really win, can you? But all you can do is try. So UV light traps, say now the LEDs, these are just 4 watts. So you can see the 2 red crosses there, that's Harter Crags above RSPB Haweswater. So Lee Schofield very generously gave us all the choice of either abseiling down from the footpath at the top or rock climbing and scrambling up from the bottom. But we had moth traps here and there through basically 2018. And the ravines are amazing. The botanists have been there first and found all these rare alpine plants. But again, I was quite worried because the moth traps were so effective. And when you measured the early morning temperature, you found that it was warmer way up here than down at base camp at the forest, Nadel Forest and RSPB. So these rocks are probably acting as a storage heater. So on a sunny day, they'd gain the heat, and actually the nighttime and dawn temperature was higher than at lower altitude. I have to say that's cheating. That moth, that's a bucket in Ecuador, but you literally had hundreds and hundreds of moths in these buckets. And it worried me that it was such a tight microhabitat that you could probably trapping every moth in the microhabitat. So we only did it every 2 weeks in order not to damage the populations.
Why you press no? When you press no.
Right. Now, oh, with the laser.
No. We need your.
Oh, no, hang on. All right, hold on.
Time it down to reboot.
Well done, Frank.
Oh, good work. Thanks, Frank. Thanks for that. That's a lifesaver. So you have to think that all these things, UV light is known to damage the human retina and the lens. So it can either give you cataracts or retinopathy. So you have to be a bit careful with this. And I've got retinopathy myself, and it did come on when I was doing a lot of moth trapping with a 125 watt mercury vapor light. I think it's largely due to high blood pressure, but that's why all the public events we do come to a moth morning, and just look at the catch, but don't damage your eyes. So a bit of caution there, and it's maybe not that well known. There's some slightly sort of laissez-faire attitudes to it around the country. So the mercury vapor, so that's 125 watt, and you either need the mains or the generator. I'll skip over this fairly quickly because I think with the best will in the world, most moth trappers will know about it, and it's probably of limited interest to most who aren't moth trappers. So the mercury vapor, it's hugely powerful, uses up a lot of fuel. I know a lot of the reserve managers don't like it. So there's a reserve in South Cumbria where someone plonked one of these down by a nightjar nest, and the nightjar's deserted, which wasn't very clever. So certainly most reserve managers are a lot happier with the low voltage, low wattage, 3-watt lights, say, rather than these big powerful things. So they'll probably gradually be replaced, to be fair. The actinic tubes are nice, so it's just like a little tube light, which has got mercury vapor in a lot lower power. They're thought, if you're using it in an urban area where the neighbours, small kids, public place, they're thought to be the least damaging to the human eye, and they're used in meat factories, butchers, shops, things like that as fly zappers. So if they are damaging to the human eye, well, everyone's using them. So they're safe in that sense. UV LEDs, although they're low wattage, it's new technology, and you can't be sure whether they may damage eyes or not. So we tend to use them in very remote places, not public places where there are kids or families like, oh, what's that? Let's have a look at that. But they're tiny, they seem to even work. And Hawes Water, one of them inadvertently put it underneath a waterfall that didn't have any water in when we put it out, but there was a rainstorm at night, and it had flowed about 30 foot down, and with obviously no moths, the trap had washed over, but both the light and the battery were working fine under 4 inches of water, just show how durable they are. So again, for people who are starting out, sometimes these blooming things just don't work. So the common reasons for why they don't work, and you go into a lot of effort and get frustrated, is if you put them out where there's light pollution. I think Frank's tried where you live, and there's a lot of big farmyard lights, things, and it's maybe not that great. If you put them out on a full moon and a clear night, you've got the light distraction of the moon. Whether the air temperature seems to be the biggest factor. Roughly, if it's much below 8 degrees, you're going to catch very little. And some moths, like the red underwing down there, don't respond to light anyway, and some of the day flying moths. So those are the sort of commonest reasons why you think you're going to have a fantastic catch and you wind up getting very little or nothing. So again, in terms of safety for the moths, there is a butterfly conservation code along these lines, that it never really seems to get publicized or followed. But it does make, if you just think, well, if the moths weren't sitting in your moth trap hotel all night, what they're going to be doing, they're going to be mating, they're going to be egg laying, they're going to be nectaring. So if you put it out every blooming night repeatedly, you almost certainly, you must be damaging the population. Early morning inspection before the birds get at it, release them into deep cover. Again, try and avoid predation by birds. And if you've got to take them off site for whatever reason, sometimes you do, make sure you're releasing them into the right habitat and the right food plant, and ideally release them on trapping site. I think we probably won't talk much about cameras, because that basically a little compact camera or your mobile phone camera will do almost everything. And you can get, for mobile phone cameras now, you get a clip-on micro lens for about 20 quid that does ×40 magnification. So you don't need the expensive fancy kit, I think is the message. And these little digital microscopes that clip into your laptop are very good for the micro moths and fine detail. So that's a canary shouldered thorn, common moth that's been out the last few weeks. And it's amazing. It's like a Hollywood diva. It's got these like false eyelashes on, which until I photographed it under a little microscope, I would never have seen that. And I think you can get them certainly less than 100 quid now. So compared to fancy camera kit, they're quite cheap, the microscopes. Lots of people don't do photography and don't like it, don't want to, no reason why they should. So the alternative is to pot them up, and particularly in a group, pass the pot round, and it gives you a three-dimensional rather than two-dimensional look at the moth and the structure of the legs, structure of the antennae, looking at them in a glass pot. So you don't necessarily need, if you haven't got a camera, don't want to photograph it, certainly records without photos still widely accepting, but a little bit like with birds and other, for real rarities, you're certainly on safer ground by getting a photo and then a GPS location ideally. And same as with birds, if you know you've got a real rarity, then just click a frame of a obvious site like Anthorn masts or whatever that proves you where you said, and you didn't sort of snitch the photo from Ecuador or whatever. A little bit on what's been happening the last year. We've got this wretched climate change, and I always measure the dawn temperature when I do moth tracking, either home or remote sites. So at Cymru this year, you can see the dawn temperatures. It was really warm end of January, around about beginning and end of January. And then the temperature actually fell off during a lot of the peak moth trapping season. And then the heat wave in July, and it's falling off again a bit. But really, it's not what you'd expect, a normal distribution curve of nighttime temperatures, both abnormal cold and heat. And then if you look at the number of moths in one of those bucket traps, 3-watt UV light, so if it's less than 5 centigrade, you get near as damn it nothing. And if it's 18 centigrade, it goes way up. So and the national schemes, other than one of them, don't record the nighttime temperature or other basic weather parameters like BTO surveys do, which is a real shame, because for minimum effort, it means we're missing out on such key data that has confounding variables. So personally think that really we should be recording these basic parameters because they have such a massive influence. And again, this year, this is one of our commonest early autumn moths, green bindle crescent, and it's got 2 polymorphic forms. So the common form has these beautiful green iridescent scales, and then the other form's got a few tiny scales, but basically is all brown. So it's a bit like you've probably heard of the peppered moth. It's all still taught in schools that it's got 2 forms. So a form that mimics lichen, cryptic for lichen, that was common up till about, I think, pre-industrial revolution. Some of the records go back to the 1700s. And then when the Industrial Revolution came along, then the dark form of the pepper moth predominated. And then when the Clean Air Act came along in the 1960s, even in urban areas, the lichen mimicking form started predominating again. So it's saying with this green brindle crescent, in a normal year, you'd get about 10 green ones to 1 brown one, certainly in Cymru, a rural area. And this year, because the caterpillars would have been around in the heat wave, again, it's speculation, and the lichens would have, they don't permanently die off, but they temporarily die off, seem to have had a pretty rapid response, where this year the majority of them with a brown form with minimal green scaling. So if probably the genetics, I don't know, but it's probably a polymorphism along the same as human blood groups, so ABO blood groups, so the polymorphic forms, you don't have to mutate to jump from one to the other, they're in the population. So if conditions then change for one or other form to be advantageous, it means they can adapt very rapidly without having to wait for spontaneous evolutions as per sort of Darwin's evolutionary concept. That is speculation, I can't prove it, I might be completely wrong. We've had some really good migrants. There's a colony of death's head hawk moth larvae found feeding on a potato patch in Dalton-in-Furness over in southwest Cumbria. Someone photographed that. It was actually just into North Lancashire, but hummingbird hawk moth, which Steve Hewitt mentions still being out and about, and its larva very rarely gets photograph recorded. It usually feeds on valerian. So this year there have been so many adult hummingbird hawk moths, and there is proof that they've been breeding, at least temporarily. And a bit like the red admiral butterfly, it may be that they can now overwinter in outhouses and slightly warmer conditions as an adult. So it may be that that's actually becoming a true resident UK species and a migrant. That's I went over to Dalton in Furness and we sieved all the soil around the potatoes, hoping to find the pupae of the larvae, but they'd wandered off across the tarmac, didn't find any. And as yet, I lent them a moth trap, which they're still using, but sadly, as yet, they haven't trapped any adult death's head hawk moths. But again, whether they'll be able to survive the winter is probably unlikely. But those are all fairly exciting things for Cumbria. And then just the last slide, see moth trapping even gets into private eye. And Stephen Mott, who's here, asked me if he bought a pheromone lure for emperor moths and got quite despondent that if he did get emperor moths, they were flying around and not settling down for photos. So told him that he was wearing the wrong uniform. that was actually taken off the is an international moth group, mainly America, but you could Facebook group or whatever. So I just took that off that, but thought that, and of course for the new members, Frank didn't mention the initiation ceremony, did he? So that's it. That's the end of the talk. Happy to take questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Guy, please?
Can I say, it's not actually a question, but it's in relation to what you said about. Hang on, we're going to use it.
We got a roving microphone, so the Zoomers. Oh, thanks, John.
See if it works.
Does it work?
Yeah.
Right. It's in relation to the comment you made about trans-Saharan migrant passerines. They've almost got like a fixed time for arrival and they're unadaptable compared to resident great tits. I've been studying private flycatchers in the Lowes Water and Withered Valleys for almost 50 years. Right. And before the turn of this century, it was unusual to have the first egg date in April. They were generally the first few days of May. But as over the last 20 years, they've gradually been getting more advanced into April. Not just the odd one, but maybe 10 nests. And 2 years ago, the earliest egg date was the 27th of April. Several broods, several pairs doing that. This year, there were 2 nests where the first egg date was the 24th of April. And there were 50 nests where the first egg date was in April. So something's happening even with trans-Saharan migrants, that when they set off from Africa on a fixed moon or a fixed wind or whatever, they don't know what it's like 3,000 miles away. But there does seem to be some response to climate change.
And do you think they do need to be, because obviously you can understand they've got to brood their feed their chicks, but do they need to build up their protein mass and nutrition before they start nesting?
Well, the female she needs to produce 7 eggs, 1 egg per day. And this year is the most, not only is it the earliest, it's the most productive in clutch size, it's the most productive in chicks hatched from eggs laid, and the most productive from chicks fledged from chicks hatched. Something's happening.
Well, that's good. So hopefully that's positive rather than negative. Thank you, John.
Thanks, John. Anybody else?
I'm going to finish saying that was really interesting. Thank you. A question: if things get really bad in food supplies, is a human?
Yes. Well, in fact, the talk here on Diptera yesterday from Erica McAllister, is it the UK Diptera expert, and I'm not sure about moths, but certainly they're farming maggots, which are high in protein, and the idea is that everyone could have their sort of maggot farm and the equivalent of their green bin at home. You don't actually need to commercially farm them, and basically sprinkle them on your cereal, on your Weetabix. and they're high in protein. So yeah, I'm sure you could do, but you couldn't do it with burnet moth larvae because of the hydrogen cyanide.
Probably a good way of reducing the human population.
Yeah.
After global warming. Longer.
Okay, any more questions? One right at the back.
It's an observation.
Hang on a minute.
I've got the, all right. I've got the Broome Cumbrian in the garden, and they were being shredded. Something was eating them. And during the day, I couldn't see anything at all. But I went out at night with a torch, and they were covered with very large caterpillars, which I thought were a large orange or yellow underwing, and also buff-worming moth caterpillars. Now, where did they go during the day?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of moth larvae are nocturnal to reduce predation. So they'll be right down by the plant stems during the day, where they're very difficult to find, and then come up during the night to feed. An interesting large yellow underwing, that was until recently, that was quoted, I think something like 75% of the entire UK moth catch in terms of individual moths was that one species, large yellow underwing. So 1 out of 2,600 species, with comprising 75% of the light trap catch. That seems to have declined in the last couple of years, but it's always quoted as the UK super moth. So again, whether it's resistant to pesticides or can develop some adaptation that we don't know of, that a lot of other species that are declining haven't got, but it's quite an interesting species.
I'll always disturb them in the garden when the find somewhere else.
Yeah. You have to be a bit careful when you record them, because predictive text corrects large yellow underwing to large yellow underwear.
Okay. Any more questions?
I just wondered how you got into Moscow.
Oh, right, yeah. Well, I was age 7. We lived in London at that time, and I was being traipsed around the London department stores as a sort of nauseous little brat to choose a Christmas present. And there was a chap about my age now, I can't remember which department store, but in a children's zoo type thing, showing a demo on tropical butterflies and moths. Obviously, way back then, they were pinned out. That was 1965, I think. And I chose a little beginner's butterfly collecting outfit, very politically incorrect, with a net, setting boards and a killing jar and what have you. And I was just absolutely fascinated by it. And I never stopped after that. And the chap who was doing the demo would never have known the impact he produced on me.
Okay. Any more questions? Rhiannon. And any questions on Zoom, if you could type them in, please.
It's not really questions, but I'm looking to record moths in my allotment. And I was just wondering if there's any way of seeing maps or any way of finding out whether someone's done it previously in the same allotment.
Yeah, there's a 2017 Cumbria Biodiversity Centre Moth Atlas. It won't show you to that level, but it'll show you, I think it's either 2 km square or 10 km square level. So, and that you can just get it free, download it for free, or request it off the CBDC website. So that's probably your best. And if you join Cumbria Moth Facebook group, everyone puts their sort of interest, and you could ask a question like that, and you get quite a lot of responses. So say there are some really rare ones, like quoted the V moth and the spinach moth, that you might be lucky and get in allotments you don't get anywhere else.
Any more questions? Okay, well, it's thank you very much for a very illuminating and talk, Guy. Very interesting facts and figures there, and some wonderful photographs. Really sort of very much appreciated And I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did. So thanks very much, Guy.
Good, thank you, Frank.
And just apologise to Zoomers for missing the records. It is recorded, so if you want to see the records, you'll be able to log in as soon as Donna uploads it to our members' website. And that sort of say that all of the talks are recorded. Hopefully this one was automatic and Donna will be able to download it more easily than she's got hold of the first one. And as I say, if you log into the members' website and you want to sort of see it over again, you can do that even. So, okay. I think the only thing now to say is that our next talk is another well-known figure, Gary Hedges, who used to be the CBDC records manager, and Gary's from Liverpool University now. And I'm sure we're in for a very interesting talk in a fortnight's time from Gary Hedges. Another sort of word I would say about Gary and Guy, they've come in quite late into the programme, and really sort of thank Guy for putting this talk together in a fairly short space of time as well. So it's very much appreciated. Thank you. What's Gary's talk on? You know?
It's threatened invertebrates in Cheshire and Lancashire.
Thank you. Okay, thanks very much, everybody, and thanks all for coming.
Good, thanks, Frank.
Yeah, it's something. Nothing like that.
How do we get out of this?
So Gary, that was, I'd like to sort of
Yeah,
compliments or uncompliment what you were saying.
yeah. Well, they say you can get them to genistone from the caterpillars. They're Genistosphobia mainly, which come out as huge films in the spring. It's about but again, that's quite variable depending on your.
I don't know what plants like actually eating.
Well, I just did a brief survey of John Miles and John on I only did it on a good year when they have done your feed, but when they came into the nest box with the 500 then quite hard and see where they are moth patches.
Let me give you, you may know, just to give me,